I closed my eyes, drew back the curtain to see for certain what I thought I knew far, far away. Someone was weeping, but the world was sleeping. Any dream will do. Some of you, I trust, recognize that as one of the opening songs of Andrew Lloyd Webber's most successful play, Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, a play that we actually performed here on several occasions. This work retells the Genesis story of Joseph with obvious Hollywood and Broadway flourishes added onto it. It's a play ripe for American audiences since it is somewhat optimistic in its worldview. In many ways, in the Joseph story, everything comes out in the wash, and a lot of Americans love those kinds of stories. We love the stories and they lived happily ever after. The song I sang, or the first part of it, speaks of the dream, and Paula mentioned the significance of the dream to the Joseph story. I have to admit to you, I have never understood, and I've sung that song many times, I've never understood the line, any dream will do. I don't know what that means, but the dream is essential to the Joseph narrative. Joseph was known for having dreams and being able to interpret them, and that's why he got famous with the Egyptians, being put to work because of that skill. A particular dream, and Paula didn't mention this one, that Joseph had was one in which he, the brother who had been thrown into the pit and eventually taken into slavery, became Lord over the brothers who had tossed him into the pit. In the dream, the one who was oppressed by his brothers finally got to rule over them. Well, in today's reading from Genesis, we get to see that dream fulfilled. Joseph has become a big wig in the Egyptian government. The way he talks about it in today's text, it sounds like he's the Pharaoh. I think Joseph has a little trouble with humility. He wasn't the Pharaoh. He was probably what we would call the Secretary of Agriculture. And his brothers are facing famine now, and they've come to Egypt. Why to Egypt? Because there's the Nile River, and the Nile River creates a great fertile ground where crops can be grown. And Joseph now is in charge of the nation's food, and therefore he has power over his brothers. His dream had indeed come to fruition, and he gets to decide if his brothers can eat. And what's more, Joseph gets to decide how he will respond to these brothers who were responsible for a horrible crime perpetrated against him. Now, most of us who know this story are warmed by what we experience in Joseph's response. Many of us see Joseph as this remarkably forgiving guy who simply wants bygones to become bygones. But frankly, if you read the story, it's much more complicated than that. Joseph is responsible for a lot of shenanigans, revenge-like actions, before he reaches the conclusion he does in today's text. So Joseph was no innocent actor. Frankly, as a kid, if you read the story, he was a spoiled, rotten brat, favored by his dad. And before he encounters his brothers today with what appears to be forgiveness, he messes around with them, and ultimately his father as well, by jailing one of his brothers, threatening to imprison the youngest brother, Benjamin, planting money on one of the brothers, so it looks like the brothers didn't really pay for the food that they are getting, and putting a famous, expensive, magical cup into the sack of the brother Benjamin to make it appear that Benjamin is nothing but a thief. The road to not seeking revenge was long and circuitous. Joseph wasn't just a nice guy who had a soft heart. He was a schemer at times, which for me is some good news, because the movement away from the need to seek revenge doesn't always come quickly. Because life and people can be tough. What they have done to us sometimes been awful. Now, revenge can feel very, very sweet. And sometimes it's even a part of the dream. Yet what we experience in the Joseph story is someone who eventually figures out there is a dream bigger than the ones that we can dream or that he dreamed. Listen to what Joseph says today. Now, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. It was not you who sent me here, but rather God. Now, I got to admit to you, I struggle with these words from Joseph. I really do. Because they can be used for some really terrible purposes, justifying all kinds of evil. They can be the means by which we belittle the pain of others. You know, and you've heard this, and you've probably even spoken it, God is making you a better person through all this pain that you are enduring. And my favorite, God has a plan for you in the midst of all of this. Well, yuck. I knock that stuff off. What Joseph's brother did to him was awful. And there is no excuse for it. There is no excuse for the bad husband you had who abused you in unimaginable ways. There is no excuse for your mom or your dad who abandoned you when you were young. All of those things are awful and should be named as such. But there's another story. So says the Joseph narrative, another narrative that we don't often understand until well after the facts, a narrative we often can't name until we're past the pain that was inflicted on us. That story, that dream, is known as God. God sent me before you. God, so says the Joseph narrative, is able to work in the midst of human shenanigans and evil to bring forth life-giving purposes. I hear this message, and I'm reminded of Richard Rohr's notion that everything belongs. Everything. This is unsettling to me, but everything, including the pain, including the struggle, including the hurt. Let's be honest, it is that which brought you here. And it is in part what has made you who you are, which again is not to justify what happened to you, but it is to say that there is something larger at work among you in the midst of the pain that will indeed bring life out of death. And that's what Joseph seemed to trust. And yeah, I get it. Sometimes it's easier to trust that when you become the Secretary of Agriculture, when you have made it big. But this claim is one of the fundamental messages of the Christian faith. God raised Jesus from the dead. God took what was awful and miserable and made something new. God raised one who was rejected by human beings. God would not stop at what people do to love. God raised love again. God's dream is always life. And it was this truth that stopped the schemer from more attempts at revenge. It was this dream that caused him to conclude that he would no longer plot to get back at his brothers, but would seek ways to care for them and their families. And it was this truth that caused Joseph to kiss his brothers and weep upon them. You know, our dreams can be pretty small. They can be. They're often about evening the score, making sure people get theirs. Retribution seems to be at the center of our dreams. Just look at the political landscape these days. Retribution is at the forefront. And often that is because we don't have an imagination big enough, dreams large enough to envision another reality. So we spend much of our lives seeking revenge because we think revenge is sweet. And it may be sweet, but it is not good for us. Listen to John Holbert. Revenge is a dish best served cold, but whether hot or cold, revenge muddies all waters, clouds hopes, and destroys the possibility of community. After I wrote this sermon this past week, I was listening to NPR, and I heard this great interview with a woman who was quoting Father Greg Boyle. And Father Greg Boyle said, you need to make friends with your wounds, or you will end up hating the wounded. And I would add on to this, you need to make friends with your wounds, or you'll end up wounding other people. And how do you make friends with the wounds? You know a story larger than the one that you've been telling yourself. You know a story that includes and welcomes even pain. You know, I suspect that Jesus must have known that truth. Otherwise, he could not have been the dreamer that he was. I mean, did you hear him today? You cannot get more dreamy than Jesus today. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Speak well of those who curse you. Resist people not by slugging them back, but by not playing their games. Give to those who beg from you. Don't ask for the things that people steal from you, and do to others as you would have them do to you. And by the way, while we're at it, don't judge, and forgive others. Wow, what a dream. Joseph's dreams came true. And some of you will say, but that dream of Jesus, that'll never come true. Well, only if you live with stunted dreams, only if you don't know a story larger than the ones that human beings can imagine, only if you get stuck in the puny story of retribution and reciprocity. And Jesus must have known a bigger story. And he describes that story today when he says that God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked, as well as the righteous. And when he proclaims that God is merciful. Jesus knew the dream of God, which is a dream rooted in compassion, love, and mercy. It is this dream that will lead to human flourishing, to reconciled families and churches and nations. It is this dream that will create hopeful futures. So, why would you want to get stuck in dreams of evening the score? Why would you want to be controlled by the desire for revenge? Even the scheming Joseph figured out how very shallow that kind of dream is.